Hi and welcome to this first webinar in our series, How to Plan Your Retirement. My name is Josh Van Gestel. I'm the Senior Manager of Education here at Australian Retirement Trust, and I'm joined by a wonderful colleague and friend, one of the education team leaders at Australian Retirement Trust, Ruth. How are you, Ruth?
I'm really well, thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
Ruth and I are going to go through quite a lot in this webinar, but we're hoping that it will really help answer a lot of the questions that we've seen coming through that Ruth will talk to you about in one moment. But before we do that, I wanted to first make three really important acknowledgements. The first is to all of you for taking the time to actually invest in your super, to think about your retirement and to consider the opportunities that you can take to make the most of it. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we are joining this event from. But I pay particular mention to the traditional owners of these lands, now known as Brisbane, where we're broadcasting from, the Yuggera and the Turrbal peoples. There is a third acknowledgement, though, that we do need to make, and I'll hand over to Ruth to talk to you about it.
Thank you, Josh. Now, it's also really important to remind everyone here with us today that the information that Josh and I will share with you will be general advice only. And what that means is we're not able to apply that to your circumstances specifically. Everyone came here today with different reasons, different strategies in mind, different motivations and different goals to try and achieve. Bear in mind the content we cover will be very, very general. This is why it's really important to talk to your financial planner if you have one, but also continue to read more information so that you are mindful of applying these general topics to your personal circumstances. Now, I'd also like to thank you all for submitting all of the questions that you submitted on your registration. Josh and I spent lots of time looking through those questions for two reasons. Number one, to make sure that the information we are bringing to you in this event is actually the information that you wanted from us. So thank you so much for helping us to shape this particular event. The other reason we like to look at those questions is to make sure that we are addressing some of the concerns and the worries that we know many retirees face as they're leading up to retirement. So I do assure you lots of those questions will be answered as we work through the content. Now, we do have a team live with us here today, and they are looking at the live Q&A box. If there are questions that pop up throughout the session, please do put them into the Q&A box, and you will very likely get a written response to that question where we can. We will have time for some live Q&A at the end as well, so we look forward to seeing your questions come through the event today. Now, as Josh said, today's event is about everything. It is a high-level look at all the things we need to be thinking about as we are entering into and planning for retirement. We will touch on various different topics, maybe a little bit lightly. That being said, there are three subsequent series that we would love you to also join when they are available. And that is where we will have a much deeper dive into some of the topics we discussed today. So it is a great idea to start with this one. It gives you a little bit of a taste of some of the topics that are going to be covered in the next three series. Today is all about understanding some of the key components involved when it comes to planning for your retirement and the types of things that you need to be thinking about, and most importantly, the types of questions you need to be asking. So what we're going to cover today is a little bit of an insight as to what retirement might look like. It can be difficult for someone who's never really thought about it before to visualize where the income will come from. How frequently can I get this income? How do I know how much I need? Things like that we're going to touch on. We're also going to talk about some myths that are out there. One of the most common ones being, do I really need $1 million? We'll dissect that a little bit and hopefully put to bed some concerns you might have. we'll talk about some of the really important things that you can do now to, what we say, awaken your super, or in other words, get that super really working for you as you're in those years leading up to retirement. And of course, we'll give you some next steps that we'd like you to consider doing as well. Now, at this stage in your life, many of you are starting to think about retirement and very likely have had superannuation accumulating for you, maybe in the back end and maybe not looking at it every day. But the reason you're here is because you are probably starting to think about retirement. And I want to remind you that the superannuation fund that you're partnering with and entering to retirement with can play a significant role in shaping, number one, how prepared for retirement you are, and number two, how you're looked after during those retirement years. Not all super funds are the same. Ultimately, we're all trying to do the same thing, but we work in different ways. It is so important that you are comfortable with and familiar with your fund of choice. I would be fairly confident to suggest that for most people in this event today, the amount of money sitting in your super fund far outweighs the money that's in your bank account. And for that reason, I want you to be very comfortable with who's looking after that money for you. So, Australian Retirement Trust is a significant super fund in the Australian supermarket here in Australia. We have almost 2.5 million members. And for them, we are looking after over $300 billion worth of retirement savings. Now, I'm not throwing those big numbers out as a flex. They are very relevant. And the reason for the relevancy is that size and that scale gives us some significant advantages for our members. One being the ability to keep our costs really competitive when you've got that number of members. That's good news for you and your retirement savings. The other reason that big scale that we have and enjoy is important to you as a member is because it gives us access to some incredible investment opportunities both here and overseas that might be a little bit more difficult for smaller investors. And that translates back to you in the form of strong and consistent investment returns. And it's the investment returns a fund can generate for you that will shape primarily how prepared for retirement you are, but also how long that asset can last you during your retirement years. So please do hop on our website if you have any more questions or you'd like to learn a little bit more about Australian Retirement Trust. I'd encourage you to do so. We want you all to be partnering with us and be confident in that partnership. Now, we're here today to talk about retirement, which is a huge chapter and an exciting one for many of us. Josh, where will we start? It's a big topic.
Well, as you said, Ruth, it is an exciting chapter for many of us, but it is also one with a lot of anxiety. And that's where I want to start, because what we're wanting to do throughout this webinar is actually give you some assurance and give you confidence in where your retirement is or could go. And just in thinking about those anxieties for a moment, we see that half of surveyed people do have concerns around their retirement. Either that it's going to start getting further away from them, that they may have to work for longer, or that they're seeing the pension age increase as it's done previously, for example. We're also seeing that people are concerned about their own funding. Will they have enough to look after themselves? But they're also worried about the support that comes from the government. Now, Ruth and I can't look into the future, but what we can do is give you absolute certainty of the rules, the conditions, the opportunities that exist for you today and how you can make the most of them. But let's just go a bit further to think a little bit about how your own circumstances, your own situation and your own needs might actually play into what your retirement will look like. Now, Ruth and I'll talk about this quite a lot, that every person's retirement is completely different. What you need may be very different to a friend, to a sibling, to a colleague. And so it's important that although sometimes it's easy to listen to others and to seek guidance from what others have done before us, that you take the time to actually think about your own situation and what we're going through in this webinar. So the first thing is to think about when you may actually retire. And I think what we know is that many people will retire as they approach 60 or 65 or even into their 70s, as this chart shows. But what this chart also shows is that for the vast majority, really up until the age of 60, if they're retiring early or earlier than the norm, they are usually doing so because of circumstances that have been thrust upon them. People retiring early are usually doing so because of health issues they have, health issues of a partner or an older parent, or also due to changing circumstances with their work. It is only later in their life, as people enter really into their 60s and then into their 70s, that we see people are retiring for their own reasons, that people are retiring because that's the decision that they've made, not that's been forced upon them. Now, this isn't to try and throw you off if early retirement is in your planning, but it's just to try and show that for many of us, retirement can come unexpectedly, and we do have to also be prepared for it. The other key consideration, though, isn't just when you're choosing to retire, but thinking about how long that retirement could possibly go for. In my own circumstances, I've got two parents who are now in their 90s. I've got aunties who are about to turn 100. So I have to assume that based on my own family history, that I am going to have a long, hopefully, and healthy life. So when it comes to me thinking about my retirement, I should also be thinking about how long I may need to plan for. Instead of thinking about living to life expectancy that may be in my early 80s or mid 80s, I have to really be thinking around the retirement for me may be well into my 90s. And that needs to be considered in the funding that I take. So the important thing for you to do is to really consider the income needs that you have and what your situation is that is different to others. And this really is an individual and personal discussion that you have to have with yourself or in seeking guidance on. Your income will be determined, or your income needs in retirement will be determined on, firstly, your situation. Are you a single person or are you part of a couple? If you're part of a couple, it means that you can share costs. It means that you're sharing electricity bills, utilities, internet. It also means that you're sharing groceries. It means that you don't have as much in terms of costs as you would as two separate individuals. The second thing you need to consider is your needs, and some of this I've touched on. If you're going to live much later in life, for example, as I know based on my family history I might have to really think about the medical expenses that I will be facing later in my life. You might be someone who has worked in physical labour all your life, and you might be actually taking some of those medical needs early into your retirement. Or you may, as we're seeing for many Australians now entering retirement, be going into retirement carrying debt, even a large mortgage. These are all needs that you need to make sure when you're thinking about your retirement income that you are planning for and expecting you are going to need to cover. Now, I know it's all sounded a bit negative to this point, but this is the positive element. The positive is then thinking about, well, if all those needs are looked after, if those circumstances are dealt with, then what is it that you want from your retirement? What do you want your retirement doing for you? And this is where you really do think about things like whether it be holidays overseas or things you'd be liking to do for your family or with friends. What are those things that don't just get you through life, but that you'd like to do to really enrich your life further? Now, as part of this webinar series, you've got access to a workbook. And on page 6 of that workbook, we actually go through some thinking that you maybe want to consider in applying these to your own circumstances and situation. But before we go a bit deeper into all of that, Ruth, maybe we talk about, now that we're getting an idea of the income we may need, how do we actually just go about paying for it?
I think this is a really important piece of planning for retirement, is really understanding and thinking about where is the money going to come from week in, week out. And that's going to be very different for everyone here today. There are going to be various different sources of income that you'll be able to generate throughout retirement. Superannuation may only be one. So let's have a little look at what the possible sources of income might be. First and foremost, you may be somebody lucky enough to have assets outside of superannuation which can generate some kind of income during retirement. The most common example I can think of here is, for example, an investment property. Or maybe you've just got a little bit of cash sitting in the bank that you've held on to that you can actually fall back on and spend a little bit of each week. Whatever the situation for you is, we do need to factor that in when we think about where some of the income is going to come from. The other thing to then think about is your superannuation and the amount of superannuation you need and the amount of income you need to come from that source will actually depend an awful lot on whether you have any other income sources and how much they might be. So for some people here today, you may not have any personal sources of income, in which case the role that your superannuation needs to play will be much more significant. And for some people who have ample assets outside super, the role that their super needs to play will be a lot less significant. And in other words, they'll need a lot less superannuation. So we do need to step back and think about the fact that super might only be one source of income. The other thing to bear in mind is that there is a safety net in Australia called the age pension. And the age pension will do a lot of the heavy lifting for some Australians who may have very little assets of their own to fund their retirement. Now, the difference with these sources of income can be when they'll start to kick in or when you can receive them. You'll see a little red dot there over the top of the superannuation arrow, and it says 60. And the reason for that is your superannuation can be accessed from the age of 60. So if you are needing to trigger that source of income at age 60 or beyond, it is something you can think about doing. 67, on the other hand, you can see over the age pension. And the reason for that is that you cannot factor that as a source of income to your household until you have reached the age of 67. That is age pension age. So what we're trying to do here is think about, if I'm going to retire before 67, where's the money going to come from? Primarily super and your own assets. After 67, then will the age pension play a little bit of the role here for me? So if we think about the age pension, I mentioned it is nothing but a safety net, and it will do a lot of the heavy lifting for many Australians. What you can see here are the current age pension entitlements for a single Australian and also what it would be worth for a couple in Australia. Now bear in mind that those rates will change regularly and they are always updated on the websites. But what I do want to remind you of is, if you cast your memory back to the slide Josh shared, where we talked about income needs, and Josh specifically called out needs and wants. What I often try to say to people is the age pension was only ever designed to fund needs. It is not really going to generate enough income for any single person or any couple in Australia to be able to play around too much with what you want to do in retirement. It is a safety net and it will do the bare minimum for you. So who receives it or when can you qualify? Number one, the most important thing to do is reach age pension age, which is currently 67 or above. And you also must have been a resident of Australia for at least 10 years. If you tick both of those boxes, you can then move on to the next stage of determining whether you qualify. So what will happen is Centrelink will apply 2 tests for you to determine whether you're eligible to receive some or all of the age pension. So they will apply a means test, both income and assets. Now, when they look at the income, they will say you can generate a certain amount of income per annum before we'll start to reduce your entitlements. And of course, as you can see here, it's different for an individual and a couple. And it's only when you go above that threshold do you start to see it impact your entitlements. They'll then apply an asset test. And the asset test is looking at your current assets. And again, there are amounts here. If you are a single or a couple, you can see the thresholds. If your total assets, excluding your own home, by the way, are under those values, you may very well find yourself qualifying for the full age pension. Above those, you might find that you're qualifying for part, and of course there's a maximum as well, which is all available for you to view on their website. Unfortunately, we have a little bit of a joke in the system. They do actually give you the worst result. So whatever pension entitlement is the lowest under both of those tests, the means test is what you'll receive. Sometimes we say that's why they call it the mean test. Now, there is a little concession available as well. The concession card is really something to be mindful of. If you do not qualify for the age pension, you may still very well qualify for the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, which can actually allow you some further concessions that you should be able to pick up, regardless of whether you've failed the means test, the asset or the income test. There is a third test for that Commonwealth Senior Healthcare Card, and it's a much more generous testing system where the majority of Australians will qualify for that particular card. Now, just remember, this is designed to fund your wants, your needs only, and doesn't really factor in your wants. Your wants are very often funded by your super, and that's the beauty of super. It's giving you the flexibility to be able to talk not just what I need to survive, but what I want to do. Unfortunately, despite the important role super plays in generating this income, many of us still don't really understand the fundamentals of it. Our own research tells us that almost 2/3 of Australians don't have a strong understanding of how super works. Let me give you a very quick 101 session. There are 2 types of super funds in Australia which you might have. The first, and probably the more older type, is called the defined benefit. The defined benefit type account is really designed to look at your years of service with your employer and your income, and it's worked out under a particular formula. You are not subject to market movements, you're not subject often to fees and things like that. You're very much subject to a formula based on how long you've been with your employer and your income. It's an older type model, very rare now for anyone coming through to have one of these. These are generally the types of accounts that you would have held for quite some time. Most of us, myself and Josh included, are using what we call the accumulation accounts. These are far more common these days, and the majority of Australians will have an accumulation account. This is designed very like a bank account. In other words, contributions will come through into the account from your employer. Those contributions will then be invested and earn returns for you, and it has a beautiful compounding effect. However, there will be debits, and the debits will consist of things like administrative costs, maybe insurance premiums, etc. But at the end of it, what we see is the benefit or the balance. So what you can see is the accumulation type of account have a few other things to factor in: fees, costs, investment, earnings. And we are very reliant on what's going into the account. The defined benefit accounts are slightly different. Many defined benefit people also have an accumulation account, so still very relevant. Now, the fundamental contribution that's coming into our account and what's feeding into the system is what we call the superannuation guarantee. We call it SG. That is, of course, the money that is coming into the account from your employer. And for many Australians, the only money coming into the account. Right now, the SG or the contribution rate is sitting at 11.5% of your income. What that means is whatever your income is, you're also receiving an additional 11.5% into your superannuation account. That will move to 12% from the financial year 25-26. So this is what's making up the bulk of the money entering the system into our superannuation accounts. And as I said, it is then invested, and we're going to talk today a little bit about how that's invested and what role you need to play. Now, that accumulation journey is the longest part of your superannuation journey very often. If you think about the average 18-year-old who is starting out their careers, maybe their part-time jobs, they are getting a superannuation account and getting these contributions put in. These contributions are then invested for potentially 40, 50 years before they ever get to retirement, if not more. So your accumulation journey is the savings part. This is where we're preparing the balances and trying to maximize every opportunity to boost those balances. There is a little part in the middle of your journey, and many of you today may find yourself sitting in this stage, and it is called the transition to retirement stage. It is applicable for anyone between the age of 60 and 65. And this stage opens up opportunities for you to continue to contribute into superannuation, continue to work. But it also just means you've got an opportunity to potentially access some superannuation. We have a wonderful module which goes into a lot more detail on transition to retirement. So please do register for the Pay Yourself in Retirement module, and we'll cover this little stage in a lot more detail. But it is an area and a stage of your journey you should be very mindful of. But the ultimate goal is the retirement stage. This is why we have superannuation, and that is what we're trying to get you to maximize your balance for. The retirement stage, as Josh alluded to, can vary in length, depending on when you retire and depending on your life expectancy and how long that money needs to last you. There are so many factors that can determine how long this will last. One being the amount of money you have when you get there, but there are other things at play, like, for example, how that money is invested leading up to retirement. Now, before I come back to Josh, I do want to talk to you a little bit about this. One of the most common questions we get is, when can I get my superannuation, or when can I start to access? And the simple answer is 60. Once you get to the age of 60, there are some shackles removed, if you like, from super, and there are opportunities, one of which is the transition to retirement account. If you're still working, there will be some availability of your super funds to draw down. However, if you have retired fully from the age of 60 or beyond, you have full access to your superannuation. So anybody here who is 60 or older or close to, and you're thinking about retirement, your superannuation is fully accessible. And the wonderful news is it's tax-free, because we don't want to be paying tax on this after the age of 60. So this is where you really need to be thinking about, just because I can doesn't mean I should. So what does that mean if I do start to access super? So yes, the shackles are starting to remove from the age of 60, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right move for you. Once you get to the age of 65, however, regardless of whether you're still working or whether you're fully retired, you have full access, full tax-free access, that is, to your superannuation. And the way in which you take that out of the system is up to you. And there are lots of different ways you might draw it down. Again, join us in Series 3 and we will go into much more detail on accessing superannuation and paying yourself during those retirement years. Now, I mentioned that the accumulation journey is all about maximizing your super balance so we can let it last as long as we can during retirement. And the question we often get is, well, what balance should I have? Is it true that I should have $1 million?
Not necessarily, and probably not, would be my answer to that question. And it's funny you raise that. I've actually seen a couple of questions almost to that point coming in through the chat. The answer to this is that the number you need for retirement is actually going to be different for every single person, as Ruth and I have already been talking about. And it's really important for you to think about what this number will be for you. It may be far less than $1 million. It may in fact be far more. But what you've also got to take into account, as Ruth has outlined, is how much of this may actually be supported by the age pension, or how much might be supported by your own investments, including super. And the reason why it's different for every individual is, as we've been talking about, every individual's needs and wants will be different. So where do you actually start? There's a couple of really great ways, depending on what your preference is, as to how you can think about how much you might need to fund your retirement. The first is what we call the 2/3 rule when it comes to income, that you need 2/3 in retirement of what you earn today. And that difference, that other third, is really what you pay in tax. Remember, as Ruth said, certainly with your superannuation, that benefit is paid to you largely tax-free. And you do see that the tax you pay in retirement from other sources, including age pension and investments, probably be far less than you would be paying during your working career. So that's the first rule of thumb. 2/3 of your current income might be what you expect you need in retirement. But if you want to dig a bit deeper, which I would really suggest you do, the second approach, if you're a numbers person, is to think about preparing a budget. And I'd really strongly suggest to you that with that budget, you think about both your needs and your wants. What is it that's coming into your account, and what is it that you also have going out? The third, and I'll talk to this in one moment, is what we call a lifestyle guide. And there's different ways that these are produced, but we're going to talk today about one that's produced by ASPA, the Association of Super Funds Australia, which gives you some really clear ideas as to how much you might need for different types of lifestyles in retirement. And the fourth and final, which we will cover off and which many other super funds also provide, is a retirement calculator. You can put in some basic information and it will provide you an indication as to how much you may need for retirement and how much income that may generate for you. So what are the different lifestyle options that are available? Well, I'll go back to something that Ruth was talking about with the age pension, in thinking that it really just covers off your needs and it is a safety net. And this is where your lifestyles in retirement really start. This budget retirement lifestyle is completely funded by the age pension. And this is, for a lot of people, their reality. This is the reality of my parents, for example, who didn't have the benefit really of a mature super system in their working lives. But the reality for people who are dependent fully upon the age pension, like my mum and dad, is that it doesn't give you a lot of room to move if emergencies or other issues come up. And I'll admit that in my own parents' case, they only survive well on the age pension because they've got 5 kids to really help them. So then it's maybe thinking about, well, especially if I don't have those children to support me, how do I think about supporting myself beyond the age pension? And again, remember what Ruth was talking about, that superannuation starts to give you real access to think about those wants that you have in retirement, not just the needs. What is it that you want to do in your time after work? So for this modest retirement, you'll see that a lot of your income is going to be provided by the age pension, but will also be supplemented by superannuation or other savings. And this will give you a lot more flexibility. It will allow you to think more about your private health insurance. It will allow you to look after emergencies as they come up. It will also allow you to think a lot more about leisure pursuits and activities, including things like domestic holidays. But where we're all probably aiming is thinking about a comfortable retirement. And a comfortable retirement is one where you're going to have income that will really allow you to be largely independent. These income numbers might be partly funded by the age pension, or there may actually not be any age pension involved. But this is where you can say that your needs are being looked after, but you are absolutely also getting your wants, your desires for retirement looked after as well. You have to think about which one of these lifestyles might be appropriate for you or which one you want. And Ruth and I'll talk through the rest of this webinar about where there are times where you maybe have to think about or have some decisions about what happens if that lifestyle you want isn't necessarily one that you're on target for. But let's go into a little bit deeper in now that we know your income that you may be aiming for, how much do you need to fund it? And again, you can see here that we're showing two very different figures between a modest and a comfortable lifestyle. Remembering again, as I've just explained, that a modest lifestyle, that income is to a large extent probably going to be covered by the age pension. It's not a lifestyle you need to actually contribute a lot to. A comfortable lifestyle, on the other hand, is one where your superannuation and your other investments are going to be really important in supplementing whatever part age pension you may receive, or remembering that you may actually not, depending on your circumstances, receive any age pension in this case. So this should actually put to bed the fact that you don't really need $1 million. But a lot of it's going to depend on how you think about your income needs and, as we've said, your income wants. So before I hand back to Ruth to dig a little bit deeper into what we can do, let me just give you a bit of a case study. And this is using our retirement forecaster. You might remember me mentioning a couple of slides ago that you can use a retirement forecaster. There's one on our website. A lot of other super funds also have one, to get a sense, by answering some very simple questions, to get a sense as to how much income you may be ending up with in retirement and what balance you'll have. So let's assume we've got a couple here. We'll call them Joe and Rob, and they're aged 60 and 58. And they've got a combined income of $120,000 and total super savings at the moment of $100,000. They are saying that they'd really like to have that comfortable lifestyle in retirement. And what that really means is that they'll need that amount that I'm showing on the bottom of the screen here. That will give them that comfortable income in retirement. So through our retirement forecaster, we add some basic information and answer some simple questions, as I said, and it's then going to give us a result. We've got the target income they'd like from now through to their life expectancy and beyond, hopefully. But what we see as we play this out is that in those early years, the younger spouse will have still some employment income coming in. The older spouse would have retired, but they'll start to be accessing income from their super. Okay, so you've got within the couple dynamic here, some income coming in from employment, but also a lot of income starting to come in from super. From the age of 67, you can also see some age pension coming into this. And as they both move into retirement, that age pension will become a bigger part of their income mix. But what you can see here is a couple of things, or two things I want to call out in particular. The first is that that target income they want isn't really being achieved for the rest of their lives. In fact, in some years, it is being considerably underachieved. The second thing I'd call out is that in this scenario, they are almost completely dependent, certainly from their late 70s, on the age pension. That means that their needs, as we've talked about, may be covered, but it may be far more difficult for them to look after any wants that they may have, or also any emergencies that may emerge. So they are a far way off of actually achieving that outcome they'd like. So what do you do if you don't have enough? The first is that you actually reassess your goals. Are they higher or more extravagant than perhaps you can afford? Do you need to bring those goals back a bit? Do you actually reassess your income needs? Okay, do you think about how much you may need, how the age pension may come into it? Do you need to think about working for longer? And by that, pushing your retirement age back. You also need to think about, and this is where Ruth and I are going to spend much of the rest of the session, and I'll hand to Ruth in a moment, what you can do with your savings to progress your super in particular further to work harder for you. So there are two things we're going to unpack. The first is how you can really make some simple steps with your super through bringing it together and also through making extra contributions to grow that balance as much as possible before your retirement. And the second thing we'll be considering is how you look at investing your super, both as you enter into or leading into retirement, but also how you should still consider investments throughout your retirement years and journey. So to start and to talk about that first one, I'll hand back to Ruth.
Thank you, Josh. So we have seen lots of questions coming through. Thank you so much. And the team are doing a great job in the back, typing answers to some of those. There's been one or two that I've picked up that I'm going to cover at the end as well. So bear with us. We are now going to talk about some of the simple steps that you can take to maximise those superannuation savings on your path into retirement. The first thing I want to say is please don't be despondent if you come out of using a forecaster tool and think that your goals are out of reach. It might just need some subtle tweaking. There might still be things that you can do that really impact the result that you can get. And we're going to show you some of those things that the couple Josh talked about earlier on, how they were able to really change the dial on their outcome by implementing some small strategies, and we're going to talk about those now. Firstly though, a little bit of housekeeping with your super. I mentioned, if you remember back at the very beginning, that the accumulation stage of our journey is when we are getting contributions in from our employer. And it's often the time where we're least connected with our superannuation, unfortunately. And what can happen sometimes historically is we move around employment, and it may have meant that we picked up more than one super fund during our journey. If that is you, please stop and just reassess whether you still need to hold multiple accounts. I generally have a rule of thumb with holding multiple accounts, and that is that if you don't know why you have multiple accounts, then I would suggest you may not need them. Multiple accounts often means having multiple fees and potentially even duplicate insurance costs being debited. One of the easiest ways to bring your superannuation together is through your online access. And you might have seen there earlier on, get connected. Every single step that we talk about implementing, you can do through your digital assets, whether it's combining your super, whether it's making contributions, or whether it's looking at investing. All of these actions are very often implemented through your online portal or your access through the mobile. So please do make sure you're connected with your super. I would be alarmed if there was anybody in this event today that couldn't look at their bank account at the drop of a hat and have a look at their immediate balance. We should be able to do the same with their super. So step number one is to thinking about bringing those accounts together whereby that makes sense for you, and really simplify your own administration when it comes to superannuation. So obviously consider the fact that when you close a superannuation account, any benefits you had, like insurances, etc., also stop. But the ultimate benefit of having everything together is ease of admin, but also the reduction of potential costs with administering your super. So that's step number one. Many of you have done it. I call getting connected and bringing your super together the housekeeping. Now let's move into the strategy. This is where you've got everything where you want it to be. You're happy with your fund. You're connected. You can see it. Now we're going to talk about getting money into your superannuation account. There are two methods, and I talked about the main one already, which was the money coming in from your employer. This is called a concessional contribution. And the reason it's called concessional is because it's taxed at a concessional rate of 15%. Now, 15% tax is probably far friendlier than the tax rate that many of you are paying during your working life. And that's why we have the word concessional on there. So that SG, employer contribution I mentioned earlier, is taxed at 15%. If you're looking at your statement or you've logged in online and you see a tax number, that's what it is. The 15% we must pay to the ATO on those employer contributions. Now, you can also enjoy that 15% tax bracket and make your own contributions under the concessional method. There are two ways you can enjoy that 15% tax bracket. Number one is through salary sacrifice. This is an arrangement that you would organise with the payroll of your employer. And you would say, please redirect some of my pre-tax money into my superannuation. I'd like to enjoy some of that 15% tax bracket as well. Another way, if you don't have a payroll or you maybe missed the boat on it and you have money sitting there and you didn't know about this opportunity, you can also put money from your bank account into your superannuation and then claim a tax deduction on it. That's really your own way of salary sacrifice, the method that most self-employed Australians have used for many, many years, but now it's an option for all PAYG workers. So the money from the employer, the money that you salary sacrifice through your payroll, or the money you put in from your bank account and then claim a tax deduction, all make up the concessional contributions. That's the good news. However, we need to be very careful that when we have a good thing, it's usually limited. So we are maxed out at a limit of up to $30,000 per person per annum. And that includes all the three types. Now, there is a caveat to the rule. So the $30,000 is in relation to the existing financial year. However, the government recognised that maybe we weren't always able to reach that in previous years, and in some cases where your balance is under $500,000, you might be able to use the unused amounts from previous years. We'll talk a lot more about that particular strategy in series number 2, which is growing your super. So if you have the ability to put money into superannuation, I would strongly recommend you hop into session number 2, where we'll cover this in a lot more detail. Now, the second way of getting money into the system is called after-tax or non-concessional. And the reason this is called non-concessional or after-tax is because it exists of money that is already in your bank account and therefore you've already been taxed on it. That then can enter into the superannuation as an after-tax contribution. The government recognises you've already done your fair share of tax on that. They are not going to tax you on that contribution going into super again, okay? Now, you might have two reasons to put that in. You might have money in your bank account and you might just want to contribute it. An example might be maybe you've got some savings that you now want to invest. Maybe you've received an inheritance or you've sold an asset. There is a way you can put money from the bank account into super. Or maybe you've got a spouse and you'd like to put some money into a spouse account. Again, there are reasons you might want to do that. We talk about them in series 3. That being said, this is a far more generous limit. It's up to $120,000 per person per annum. Now, you can use 3 years worth of this limit. So in this one, we're looking forward. In the concessional one, we're looking back. This means we can use future years to get additional money in. So there is a much more generous limit here. The reason for that, I think, is obvious. The government have already had their tax on that money, so they're allowing you to get a lot more of this type of contribution into the system. A common question we get from this one is, well, how do I do this? This is going back to get connected. When I told you earlier on that almost every move you make with Super can be done through your portal online or through your mobile app, this is one example. You will see your BPay and your reference number in there, and it is a simple bank transaction. So that's why getting connected is so important. Now, the after-tax method of getting money in is also used for people who may be entitled to pick up some government incentives for contributing money into Super. These are generally lower income earners. If you're in a household where there is a low income earner, and by low income earners, we're talking people sitting at income levels usually under about 50,000, give or take, get onto the website and have a look at all the criteria. But there is a contribution incentive for low-income earners to put money in this way and receive what we call the government co-contribution. So if you or someone in the household is a lower income earner, have a look and see what the best way to get money into the system is for you. Again, we go into a lot more detail in session number 2. Now, there's an exception to the after-tax contribution, or rather than the word exception, maybe another additional amount that you might think about contributing. And I did see 1 or 2 questions on this come through in the pre-submitteds. And this is about the downsizer opportunity. And effectively what that means is the government recognises that there are ample amounts of housing out there where there is lots of empty bedrooms. So these are the empty nesters who are now sitting in 4 and 5 bedroom houses who really can't use that to their benefit. And it's giving an opportunity whereby if you are thinking about downsizing your home, you are giving an additional amount of 300,000 that you can contribute into Super. You can consider doing that once you're age 55 or above. And what this does is allow you to be more prepared for retirement while also considering downsizing the property. Now, again, like all things with Super, there are eligibility rules to be mindful of. Lots of great information on our website on this. So if this is something you're thinking about, please do read up about it. There is one big red flag I generally say for individuals who are thinking about this, and that is that it may impact any age pension entitlements you might have been qualified to receive in advance. And the reason I say that is because I might have mentioned quite quickly and subtly earlier on that when this Centrelink are assessing you and they look at your assets, your home is not assessed as an asset. Okay, it doesn't matter what it's worth. Your principal place of residence is not an asset. As soon as you sell that and you've got proceeds from that, that additional 300,000 that you might put into Super is now an asset. Just something to be mindful of, and really highlighting the reason why seeking financial advice before you make big moves like this is so important with superannuation. These strategies can look very attractive and can be a very clear purpose in your mind, but it can be something that can backfire and have negative results if all things aren't considered. I often say it's like medication. We all know what the particular medicine is designed to do, but some of us might actually have side effects that we didn't foresee, and that's why we need to be really delving into the personal aspects behind these. So this is contributions. As I've said a few times now, we do talk a lot more about this in session number 2. If you have cash or you've got the ability to make contributions into your Super and really boost that balance in the years leading up, hop into session number 2 and we'll go into a lot more detail on them there. So that's strategy number 1. Can I get money in? Can I get a bit more in? And what's the best way to get it in? Strategy number 2 is what happens when the money is in there.
That's right. But before we do come to strategy number 2, we've had a question come in from Ian, and so I think this is both just something we can clarify but also reinforce. Ian had actually asked, can I use proceeds from the sale of my home for contributing. You've just covered that. But he's also said about if I put inheritance in, will that be taxed? So can you just clarify, in Ian's case, let's say he does receive an inheritance, how would he go about contributing that and not having tax apply to it?
I think the simple thing, Ian, is to recognise that when you're making a contribution into superannuation, you'll notice that nobody is asking where you got the money. So we're not asking you to disclose, has this come from an inheritance or the sale of a property or the sale of an asset? Effectively, if the money is in the bank account, regardless of how or why it's there is an assumption you've looked after the tax to that already. That can then be contributed into superannuation subject to the rules that I talked about, the 120 per annum or the 360 over the 3-year period. So I think to put to bed a lot of those questions, we get them a lot about inheritances. When you make the contribution, we're not asking where the money came from. So the fact it's an inheritance is actually irrelevant.
Yep. So as Ruth said, we will cover that off more in session 2, but a great question that's come through. So as Ruth said, strategy 2 is, well, once you've got the money in super, how do you grow it further? And the truth is that it is your investment performance on your super over its life, including when you're in retirement, that does most of the heavy lifting for you. If you actually went and looked at your superannuation and added up all the contributions you've received over the years, you'd see they'd only be a very small part of your overall balance generally. What for most of us you'd see is that the investment earnings that you've made over those years is actually what forms the bulk of your money. Now, we know though that investing, again going back to something I said earlier, can be something that causes anxiety. It can be something that causes concern. Superannuation though comes with one really big advantage, and that is time. So although you might be thinking that you're going to retire in a couple of years, the reality is that your super is still something that you may have for a few decades. Your super is also something that you've potentially had for 20, 30, even 40 years or more over that long time period. And the advantage that's afforded you is, although in that period you would have seen and you will yet see volatility or market downturns or market upturns, you'll know that it smooths out that ride over time. So it then really comes down to a few questions for you. How long do you think you'll need that money for before you really want to start accessing it? And that might change some of the way you think about your investments. I'll come to that in a moment. The second thing to think about is, although I said a long time period smooths out volatility, it is still something that some of us feel really anxious about. And we're not suggesting for a moment that you invest your money in a way that makes you lie awake at night. In fact, our chief economist often says that the best test with your super and with how it's invested is, can you sleep well at night? If you can, you know it's invested in the right way for you. But you need to think about volatility. If the markets are going up and down, are you okay with that, knowing that it's giving you a long-term return? Or is that something that's really going to bother you and keep you awake? The third thing for you to consider beyond time and that volatility you're comfortable with is, what level of engagement do you want to have with your investments? 90% of our members, certainly in accumulation accounts, 90% of our members really don't change their investments day to day. 90% of our members are invested the way that we have invested for them. But there is that 1 in 10 people who really likes to be actively involved in the way their money is invested and what it's doing for them. You need to decide which one of those you are. Based on the 3 of these, will determine the level of engagement, awareness, activity, and comfort that you need to think about with your investments, some of which I'm going to go through now. So as I said, we do have the advantage with superannuation of having a long-term investment horizon. And this means that we can get some really great benefits, but it also means that, as I've already talked about, you may have to ride out some periods of volatility in order to achieve those returns. What do I mean? Well, if you look at the far left of this chart, you can see that we've got cash there. And this is traditional cash investments and fixed interest investments or bonds that we know generally don't have a lot of volatility and fluctuation, both in the short term as well as the medium and long term. These are amounts that you know if you invest in, that they'll stay pretty safe, secure and stable more or less. But the trade-off is that their returns to you will possibly be quite low. So in order to get higher returns, you do need to take on a higher level of risk. And that's where you might consider investing things like infrastructure, alternative investments, which I'll go through in a moment, or shares, even thinking about property. Investment assets that we know will go up and down, but also over the long term tend to give stronger returns as well. You have to decide the trade-off that you have between the return you want and the comfort you need. So at Australian Retirement Trust, we invest in all of these investments for you. If you've never made an investment decision with your account, you're likely, when you log in, as Ruth has suggested, to see that about probably 40%, perhaps even closer to 50% of your account balance is in shares unless you've chosen to invest it a different way. And those shares will be both here in Australia as well as shares owned globally. As I've already mentioned, the great thing about shares is that we know over the long term, they do give very strong return, historically certainly. But what we also know is they come with great short-term volatility. And we've seen a lot of that in markets, particularly since the COVID pandemic. So to try and balance out some of that volatility is where we also invest our members in cash and fixed interest. And if you've never made an investment choice, you will see that we do automatically put some of your money here to try and balance out that volatility that occurs day to day. But the reality of these two traditional areas of investing is that firstly, as I've already mentioned, cash doesn't tend to give the returns our members demand. Members want more than 1, 2 or 3% returns that these are often deriving, certainly as we came out of the pandemic. The other thing is that when it comes to shares, they're quite concentrated, particularly here in Australia. So we have to look for investment opportunities far beyond that. Especially as Ruth said, being a very large fund, it does give us the ability to go out to market and look for other opportunities for you that you may not be able to access individually. And these include things like infrastructure, roads, rail, airports, but also renewable energy production or even digital warehousing. These are emerging technologies as well as those traditional infrastructure assets that you would know very well. The advantage of these is that they don't just give us access to the capital value of that asset, but they generally also provide an income. Think of a toll road or an airport, for example. We also invest in hundreds of thousands of properties, commercial, industrial, residential, here in Australia, but also globally. A lot of people are very attracted to the idea of investing their super in property, but if you are doing that individually, it often means you are putting all of your money into a concentrated property and taking on all of that risk. It also means when you need to access that money, it's very difficult. You can't just sell a bedroom, for example. So with a large fund like Australian Retirement Trust, we invest in hundreds of thousands of properties to achieve a great outcome for our members. And then we also invest in what is called private equity. And this recognises that 2/3 of all large companies globally are not invested or not listed on the stock market. They're actually privately owned. And we want to make sure we've got access to them. The other advantage of them is, unlike the share market, which goes up and down very much based on the whim of investors minute by minute or day by day, private equity tends to be a little bit more immune to that. So we invest in large companies here in Australia and overseas that are not accessible on the share market. And these have provided us with some incredibly strong returns for our members. So when it comes to how you want to use these, you have three choices. The first is, like the 90% of members I referred to that have chosen to do nothing with their investments in their super, we will choose for you. And the default option is our life cycle or lifetime investment option. And that's where we will actually manage that investment for you over time. You may actually decide you want a little bit of control, but not too much. And this is where you can come into our purpose-built diversified options. Different options that give you access to a range of those assets that I talked about. And these include our high growth option, which has a large exposure to things like shares and property and private equity, right through to our more conservative options that have a higher exposure to things like cash and fixed interest. The other choice you can make, though, is to say, well, maybe I want some money in those things, maybe you don't. But what you may want to do is actually choose specific asset classes you want to invest in effect, making your own investment portfolio, deciding what exposure you want to Australian shares or what exposure you want to property or diversified investment options. You basically construct the portfolio that you want. All of these, as I said, will be influenced by the engagement you want. They will also be influenced by how you feel about investing and also how much control you want to take on. So just very quickly, as we do cover this more in future sessions that we're providing, I just wanted to highlight some of that mix I was referring to. And these are four of our main diversified options. High growth on the left through to the conservative balanced option on the right. And what you can see is that high growth option, as I talked about, has a much more significant investment in things like shares and alternative investments. Whereas going over to the right, you can see that conservative balanced option has a much bigger exposure to things like cash and fixed interest. You can expect generally that the investments on the left will have more volatility but provide a stronger return over time compared to those on the right. But the long game is what you need to think about. Even if you're entering into retirement, remember you've still potentially got 20 or 30 years ahead of you. What I'm showing here is if you've invested $10,000 and just had it pegged to inflation, what is that money going to be worth to you over time? And you'll see here that over about 20 years, the value of that has not quite doubled. So if that's your cost of living that you need to invest beyond, you need to actually have investment performance going higher than that, what do those different options I just showed you give you? This is that same $10,000 without additional investments going in, additional contributions going in over a 20-year period, where it would be at the end of 2024. This is our balanced option, our balanced risk-adjusted option, and our conservative option. As you can see, all do suffer volatility, but to far different extremes. And if I can highlight for you just some moments in time, you can see right back in 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. I can well remember how big that felt, but on this chart, it actually looks far smaller. Or if we move through to the early 20s, you can see the downturn that was that forced financial crisis from COVID. But you've seen incredible growth in the years since. This is why it's really important that when we talk about investing for super, we do have to have a discussion about the importance of long-term and volatility. So let's go back to Joe and Rob, who I introduced to you earlier, and then I'll hand over to Ruth to go through a few things and to start wrapping it up. But what we've got here is a revised plan where Joe and Rob have decided to actually change their investment options and to invest in a more aggressive investment option. They've also made the decision, which I understand in times like now where cost of living is difficult, but they've made the decision to actually start investing some of their money into super to take advantage of some of those tax advantages and opportunities available to them. If we play out that same retirement forecast for them, what we're seeing is that now they have a far less of a dependence on the age pension. It's still there. It's still very much a part of their investment mix and their income mix, but you can see that they now have super well into their 90s. That gives them that flexibility, that freedom, that choice, and it also means that should something occur or should a want or desire emerge that they want to follow, they have that opportunity. So superannuation isn't necessarily talking about giving you complete financial independence, but it is absolutely talking to how you can get flexibility and freedom for many of us in addition to the age pension. So the last thing I would give you to think about, and then I'll hand to Ruth, is to really explore investments. It is an area that many of us feel anxious about or uncertain about or confused by. But our website gives you some great resources and information to assist you. It also gives you access to our investment profiling tool that allows you to understand how you would deal with different levels of volatility and what sort of investments you may want to consider. On that note, I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Josh. We are almost at the end, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a recap on what we have done with regards to the simple steps that you can take, regardless how close to retirement you are. So remember to look at the retirement calculator. This will give you a good insight as to how prepared or unprepared you might be when it comes to your superannuation balance and whether you're on track to do what you want to do. I talked about the benefits of bringing your superannuation together, not just from an ease of administrative perspective for yourself, but also because of the potential cost savings that you might have when you bring all of those accounts together. Think about making extra contributions into your account if and when you can, but also think about the best way to make those contributions. We do have a wonderful calculator on our website. If you just go to the main page and type in contributions calculator, it will really help you and prompt you to look at your situation. It uses your income and it will give you a little bit of a sense as to which method might give you the greatest benefits of getting money into the superannuation system. And as Josh has just covered, think about how your super is invested and what that means for you. Now, all of that is a lot of information to digest, so please do bear in mind that we are strongly encouraging each and every one of you to go now, read more, learn more, and most importantly, ask questions. If we did our job well here today, we've probably triggered more questions that you need to ask than what we have answered. That is a great thing. If you now know all the questions that you should be asking because of this session that you didn't know to ask, then you've had great success by participating in today's events. Use the calculators, use the tools. There are podcasts and webinars and all sorts of learning opportunities, different channels. We all learn in a different way. So please choose your channel of preference and really engage in your superannuation. And as I said, talk to the experts. The experts know what questions to ask. The experts know potentially what the side effects might be to making any strategic decision when it comes to superannuation. Now, we are at time for questions, and we've seen some wonderful questions coming through. But before we do, I just want to remind everybody about the channels that are available for talking to us more about your superannuation. If that is what you'd like to do, please do reach out, give us a call or hop onto the website. We are here ready, willing and able to guide you and assist you on your journey into and during retirement. And again, like always, your voice matters a lot when we build these platforms and these events. We want to know what you want to know so that we can bring relevant information. We want to make sure that when you've participated in an event like this, yes, we might have generated more questions, but you're also walking away feeling motivated to look further, feeling a bit more comforted in what you've managed to learn. What can we do better? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? You need to tell us that. We read it very carefully. We apply all of your feedback every time we look at events. We are so mindful of what our members want us to bring to them. You will receive an email after participating in today's event. Please do take the time. It's not a very long questionnaire, but we would love you to take the time to share your feedback so we know if we're missing the mark on certain points or not. And as we've said throughout the session, please do participate in one of the further modules if you can, because we do go into a bit more detail on some of those things. Now, bearing in mind, we do have lots of questions, Josh. So if there's one in particular that you liked throughout the event, please do feel free to call it out now. And I've got a couple that I saw come through as well that I'll address.
The probably question that I saw that was interesting that came through was, you talked a lot about combining super, and there was a question there that actually asked about, can I combine my super with my wife or with my partner? Do you want to just talk to that for a moment? Because it came up actually a couple of times.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it is one we get a lot. No, you can't, basically. Yes, you can be part of the same superannuation fund, but each individual has to hold their own superannuation account. Speaking of spouses and partners, actually, there was a really good question that I spotted when it came. It's a contributions question as well. And it was about contributing into a spouse account. I had a slide there that had two little bubbles come through. One have said you might put an after-tax contribution into your spouse. The question was, why would I contribute super into my spouse account?
And dare I say, I did notice you skipped
through it, yes. So I was conscious of time.
No, absolutely. So there was that slide where Ruth was talking about if you make a non-concessional contribution, an after-tax contribution, that it might give you access to the government co-contribution. There's another advantage. If that after-tax contribution is made by a spouse into your account, if you're a lower income earner, as Ruth was talking about, if you're a lower income earner, that contributing spouse may actually be eligible for what's called a tax offset. So they can actually apply that to reduce their own tax in their tax return. So it's a really great incentive to think about, although you can't combine both your super accounts if you need to keep your account individual, but you can still think about, well, how do we manage contributions across a couple? And so there may be advantage in you going, well, instead of putting a contribution into my account, I'll actually put it into my spouse's account. if they are beneath that threshold, that income threshold, that then gives you a tax advantage. So don't necessarily just be limited by what you can do with your own account. Ruth was talking about, if I think about the co-contribution, just go off topic for a sec. If you've got a lower income earner in your household, as Ruth was mentioning, it's a really great way to think about putting some after-tax money into their super and getting a government co-contribution. I can tell you what, as soon as my son, he's currently 11, he's already talking about getting his first job, but can I say as soon as Jonah starts working, I'm going to make sure that I'm making contributions or giving him money to make contributions that he can then get a co-contribution on top of. Really great effective strategies. Don't necessarily apply to you. Think about it for others in your household.
I'm trying to imagine how excited an 18-year-old would be with a super contribution. You might need to sell that a bit harder to him.
I think he just dreams of some luxury job like working at Macca's as soon as he can. Maybe it's his way of escaping the house. I don't know.
Look, lots of brilliant questions coming through, and the team have done a great job responding to the majority of them with a written response. People talking about gifting, so giving children money, and will that help me qualify for the age pension if I can, reduce the amount of assets I've got?
So we do actually talk about gifting in session 4. We cover the age pension in a bit more detail in that session. There are very strict rules on gifting in how much you can effectively, maybe the terminology is wrong, but how much you can give away to help you with accessing the age pension, or how much you can gift without it causing issues or consequences with the age pension. So if that's an area that's really important to you, I'd suggest that you do watch that 4th webinar, the Thrive webinar. That will go into it in more detail. But I think the comment I would make is a bit like everything else you've talked about. Gifting is a great idea, thinking about helping your kids or your grandkids, even if it is ultimately to also help you with age pension, for example. But it can have consequences. The last thing you want to do is to be generous with your money if you can be, and then realise that that's going to cause an impact as to what the government may give you. So I would really, as I said, if that's something that you're wanting to look at, really think about attending that 4th session. If I can jump in, a question came up that is, I'm going to put straight out, is not one we can answer, but I think it brings up a really interesting point to consider. And the question that's come through here is it possible to grow my super without too much risk over the next 5 years? I think part of what we've been talking about today is what's your income needs and goals in retirement, and how much money do you need to fund it? And if you're finding that the amount you need to fund it is pretty much on track, that maybe means that you can pull back that lever a little bit if you wanted to when it comes to investments. But remember that there are 2 levers that you can use to really grow your money. And one of those is contributions that Ruth covered. The other is in making investment decisions. If you do have to lean in on that investment lever, then risk probably becomes a real thing that you need to consider and balance it out. Now, why I say I can't answer that question is because we just don't know the reality of the world ahead of us. We've certainly seen a lot of change earlier in 2025 with global politics and what's happening around the world. We saw the COVID crisis a few years ago, which none of us saw coming. None of us were prepared for that, certainly with financial markets. So risk to some extent is an unknown. What I would try and give you confidence in, though, is 2 things. Firstly, where you're in one of those diversified investments, for example, remember that we're managing your money across a whole range of assets. And that's to try and, in some cases, to actually smooth out that volatility, but also focusing on the long term. The second thing I would say to you is that it is those periods of volatility. If you remember the chart I showed that looked at the COVID downturn, but then this enormous growth that occurred afterwards. If you are in a really conservative investment option, this is something I'll talk about in session 2 actually, but if you're in a really conservative investment option, might be great during a downturn, but then it means that you could potentially also miss out on that upturn as well. So just as I said, not necessarily something that we have an answer to, but certainly something that highlights the importance of you thinking about the risk you're willing to take on and then making sure the investment you're in is appropriate to that.
2 very quick ones that I'll address here. There was an interesting question about salary sacrifice. When can I stop salary sacrificing? Do I have to continue with this? The answer is you can stop, change salary sacrifice arrangements with your employer when you want to, depending on how, I suppose, supportive the payroll are with adapting changes regularly. It is not something you're locking in for life. If you engage in a salary sacrifice arrangement, then you can also stop it by just approaching payroll and asking them to change the amount or stop that amount. So it isn't something you need to be too concerned on. You're not locking in forever. The other quick question was about how do I change my investment options and my investment portfolios. Really simply, you can do it online through the mobile app or through logging into the dashboard. We do not charge you any costs to switch in between the portfolios. And remember as well, Josh talked about various different options. You don't just have to pick one. You can actually hold multiple options at the same time until you find a weighting and a blend of investments that suits you and your needs. Now, if you're not confident to do it yourself through your online accounts, give us a call on 13 11 84 and our operators will help you talk you through that process. So lots of different ways to do it, but it is something that's really, really simple. Just hop online is probably the easiest way.
Last question that I've got, and it's actually a bit of a wrap-up question. So if there's something you've got, now's your time.
No, I think we've covered the team behind have done a great job answering most of them actually. So
the question I've got here is, what do I do next? I think someone who's probably been a bit overawed by anything. I would actually answer that in 2 ways. The first, and then I'll let you expand if you'd like. But the first is, as Ruth said, we've got a whole series of webinars now that really delve into these topics further. So if you've started to get some new questions that you need to answer, that's a really great way for you to start to get some of those answered or to think about them. So do register for those webinars and think about that. The second thing about what's next though, or what do I do now, is I would really encourage you to make sure you've got that housekeeping right. Make sure that you've got your online access, that you've got that tangibility. But I'd also say as part of that housekeeping, you've got a workbook, as I've mentioned, as part of this webinar series. Jump into that workbook, start filling it out a bit. Start thinking about those needs and wants. Start thinking about your income needs, and that can actually start helping you as we move into those next sessions. But on that note, I might pass to you and let you wrap, actually, have the final word. I don't give it to you often.
No, you don't. I'll take it. I will say to that question, what to do next, I'll tell you what not to do next, and that's panic. Please don't panic if after today you've realised that you're not prepared and that you feel like you can't ever get to where you want to. Where there is a will, there is a way. And sometimes that might mean us helping you redetermine what your retirement goals are and what you're trying to achieve. So what not to do is panic and be stressed about your superannuation and your retirement. We want to work with you to make this one of the best chapters yet. So please do reach out, talk to us, engage with us, ask those questions, and we'd love to see you partake in one of our next series to learn more. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much.